So today we're talking about a huge part of ending trafficking that doesn't always get enough focus, and that's about ending demand. This is something that we're very passionate about at Shared Hope International and something that's going to be a huge focus in season 4. So Yvonne, I'm so happy to have you back on the podcast for season 4. And I'd love to hear from your perspective. Why is demand the core issue that we need to be talking about when it comes to prevention?
Well, trafficking exists because there's a demand for it. If there's no one buying, there would be nothing to sell. Prevention starts with stopping the demand. And to make it more clear for people, if there weren't a person shopping for sex, which is called demand, then there wouldn't be anybody, right? So that's just the demand piece of it.
Yeah, exactly. And every time we talk about prevention, right, that word prevention, without talking about demand, we're only really addressing half of the issue. We have to get to the root of it and we have to cut it off there because countering is prevention, right? Countering demand, ending demand, that is prevention. And so with Shared Hope, when we talk about our involvement in the fight about ending demand, Yvonne, I know that you've been with Shared Hope for quite a long time now. How many years have you been with Shared Hope?
14 plus.
14
I
years.
lose
So
track.
yeah. So I'd love to hear, from your perspective, what has Shared Hope's position been in the fight in ending demand?
Well, Shared Hope has been a leader in shining the light on demand from the very beginning. And I always remember that, even from like Renting Lacey coming out the book. But before we had the Just training conferences, we did training events. We would train first-time responders on how to identify and respond to victims of. And we did a lot of language change in the very beginning because even domestic violence took 30 years for people to actually get it and for the laws and for victims to receive services. And it all started with language because it used to be called domestic disturbance. Now it's domestic violence, right? And so we knew there was that language thing there, but we were working with lawmakers, law enforcement, with communities to shift the focus from blaming victims to holding the buyers accountable.
Yeah. We have to hold the buyers accountable. And that is, changing the laws. We've pushed for stronger laws. Like you said, training law enforcement, attorneys, judges.
Shared Hope, before the Just training conferences, we would train first-time responders, and that was, on how to respond to victims of trafficking, lawmakers, law enforcement, and the communities. But what I wanted to add with that is Shared Hope International trained first-time responders on how to identify victims of trafficking. And a lot of people didn't know what first-time responders meant. They thought just law enforcement. But it was law enforcement, FBI, nurses. It was schools, so teachers, principals, counselors, anybody that can be that first adult in a child's life. So that even means foster parents, CPS workers. And I used to often joke that my favorite part of the training was training law enforcement and FBI, because I got to train law enforcement on how to respond to victims of trafficking because I was a victim myself. And so many times law enforcement would come up to me afterwards and say, you know what, a lot of things make sense now. And I didn't know that. And so I got to train an officer on how to respond to somebody like me. And there was something empowering in that,
But it's all in the hopes of targeting buyers, and ending that demand and help to change how people even talk about trafficking with the language, like you said. And so what I was hoping to do in this episode is actually take a glimpse back at a few projects that Shared Hope has done to show people. So we do have a clip here that we'd love to show our viewers, or, if you're listening as well to the podcast. This first clip is from a documentary that Shared Hope did. It's called Buyers Beware. And you're just going to hear about why we need heavier sentencing and heavier penalties for buyers.
We have an individual who has pled guilty now, and he's looking at a 15-year mandatory minimum. And I've heard from several people who said that's way too long for someone trying to, just trying to buy sex with a child. Well, with Mr. Gravens during his online chats, he said, I see you have a 12-year-old. I really want a 10-year-old, but I'll take the 12-year-old if I don't have to use condoms and I can take pictures. Before people judge and say, you're being harsh on these guys, you should see what we see.
I was just sick, but it told me this. We have to dig in and fight.
I really believe that most buyers felt like they weren't going to get caught, and I think also that if they did get caught, nothing was going to happen to them.
Shared Hope conducted a study in 2014 of buyers, and we found that 26% of the buyers of commercial sex with kids did not spend a day in jail. We've got a serious problem of tolerance.
My own ignorance was my biggest barrier. And it wasn't until I became a member of the Governor's Council, it wasn't until I went to the Shared Hope Conference that I understood that even in our own community, we probably have a problem.
Yeah, so that was just such a powerful clip that we just saw and heard from our project, The Buyers Beware. And before we continue to kind of go on with this conversation, I wanted to share one more clip that I thought was really powerful. This is from some research that we did in our Demanding Justice project and documentary. And what you're about to hear is a clip that goes into an interview done by Lawrence Taylor, who is a former NFL player. I believe he played for the Giants. So you're going to hear kind of from his perspective as a buyer, why he thought he could get away with what he did.
In 2006, the U.S. Department of State asked Shared Hope International a simple question: what is driving the markets of sex trafficking? But we found a more insidious, pervasive force propelling the commercial sex industry forward and creating the market for sex trafficking. Demand. People who purchase sex acts with children intentionally or carelessly and with little fear.
I'm not the cause of prostitution, and sometimes I make mistakes and I may go out there, but I didn't pick her up in no daggone playground. She wasn't at hiding behind a school bus or getting off a school bus. This is a working girl that came to my room. It's all clean. I don't have to worry about your feelings. I can't worry about it's all clean. I'm not saying it's right, but God, I think it's the oldest affection in the world.
Lawrence Taylor, Hall of Fame linebacker for the New York Giants and guest commentator on ESPN, paid $300 for sex with a 16-year-old girl in a New York hotel room. Under the federal TVPA, Taylor could have been convicted of a felony with a sentence of 10 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. But in a New York State courtroom, he pleaded guilty to 2 misdemeanors and was sentenced to just 6 years of probation. Not a day in jail. And the victim, the 16-year-old girl, was left to rebuild her life without justice.
So we're still fighting today, from pushing better legislative to supporting survivors' voices to educating communities that buying a person is never okay or normal. I remember the Lawrence Taylor case vividly, and I remember watching it, and I remember talking with Linda, and I was like, Linda, this is crud. Obviously, I used language back then, but
Yes.
it really ticked me off because Lawrence bought her knowing how old she was, because he had to have requested her in particular because of her age. And then he beat the crap out of her and said, well, he paid for it. That's what she wanted. No, she didn't want that. Nobody wants that. So Lawrence Taylor case really was my coming out as a survivor and coming under the protective wing of Shared Hope International. And it was just so vivid back then. And I could really see all the BS that Lawrence Taylor was spewing in all his interviews, because I knew the real truth, right? Not that I knew his truth, but just being in the world of trafficking that I was in, there's guys, they particularly ask for somebody who looks 12. There's things that we were asked to do and I was asked to do to make it seem like I was a virgin. There's procedures you can do that. So buyers specifically ask for something like they're going to a restaurant and they get something off a menu and that's their dinner, you know. So comments that Lawrence Taylor made that, you know, it was okay, that's normal, this is what this is what she wanted, this is what she asked for, or I paid for it, or the biggest one, I didn't know how old she was. That was crap right there.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry,
Exactly.
I could go on and on with that. It
Yes,
just makes me mad.
absolutely. Well, it's infuriating because he talked about it so matter of fact. And that shows us that we need a culture change, because the fact that he could just kind of say, well, she was a working girl. She wanted to do this. You know, I paid her. There were no feelings involved. So that feeds into the cultural norm of it all, of buying sex, especially with a minor. Oh, I didn't know how old she was. That it's just a transaction to them, right? And then that stereotypical, like, especially like a buyer like Lawrence Taylor, who's a male, that it's like, oh, well, boys will be boys. This is just what you do. This is part of it. This is something that we have to get ahead of, and we have to shift the culture and shift people's mindsets, how they think about this, that when they hear interviews like that, it has to stir something inside of you to want to end that type of mindset. And so I have one more kind of historical clip that I wanted to share that kind of talks about the need for this type of culture shift. And in season 1 of Invading the Darkness, our founder, Linda Smith, had an interview that she was talking about ending demand in one of the episodes. And in this episode, she talks about kind of what you were saying, Yvonne, that it's such a refined market in the United States. It's underground, but it's very refined. It's a well-oiled machine. And if someone asks for something, they're going to get it because of how our culture has tolerated it. So let's go ahead and take a listen to this clip from season 1 of the podcast.
Our nation wants to go, no, it's not about the buyer. It's about the bad guys, the traffickers. Well, do you think the traffickers would be bringing our children to market if there weren't a buyer out there asking for services for younger and younger kids? No, it's a demand-driven market. When we did the trafficking research around the world, and we went into each country, it was set up under a grant from the State Department, and I set it up to identify all of the factors. But even then, it was set up to identify the property owners, the facilitators. So look at who was getting the money, who was helping them get the money in the Netherlands, Jamaica. 2/3 into the research, we were writing it. We had all this video, all this undercover. I didn't like it. I'd written most of it. The 3 people working with me on each of the countries, we were getting close to having it written, and I said, it's just wrong. We have to stop and make sure that people understand the full market. What is the culture? Like I mentioned in Japan. What is the culture in Jamaica? What is the culture in America, in Washington, D.C., in Atlanta, Georgia, in Las Vegas, that would allow open sale of individuals and pretend there weren't children there? We had found in Las Vegas, there was a place, a great place where they would bring the kids that were picked up at the casinos or the places, bring them in, they'd identify their little purses with the condoms, the other things that the girls had, and identify them, and then they would hold them. They allowed us to go in and review the files, and it wasn't very long before it was really clear to us that you should have been able to see if the child has a condom. You pick them up at one of the casinos at 4 a.m, that there's enough sale, 1,400 children that were most likely trafficked. Could we prove they weren't selling themselves when we figured out they were brought in from Michigan? Not really, but what 13, 14, 15-year-old do you know that could make their way cross country, arrange the money, understand where to go? Nah, there was a marketing network in America, and it was children. So we go to Atlanta, Georgia, and we start looking at the system of the strip clubs, of the conventions, of the marketing system. We follow it all the way to the hotel rooms. It's greased. It is a procedure. It is absolutely refined.
So as an overcomer, I can tell you, if we don't slow down and stop demand, the cycle's going to keep going. More kids will be victimized. More lives will be shattered. We have to decide that the lives of vulnerable children, our vulnerable children, matter more than someone else's temporary satisfaction. Ending demand saves lives.
It really does. It really does, Yvonne. And I'm so happy that we're able to kick off this season with this topic, because as we go into season 4, we're really starting to focus in on the trainings that are needed, the prevention that is needed in the field from survivors, overcomers perspective, lived experience perspectives, what could have been done in their situations to end it sooner? How can we get ahead of, it even happening to certain demographics and children in our country, because it is completely preventable and it has to start with the buyers. So I'm very excited to dive into this season with that being our main focus. How about you?
Absolutely. It's not just to raise awareness, it's to raise the standard, right?
Yep, it's raising the standard in the field, holding people accountable. And at this point, I think Kim even mentioned it at the end of last season, but there's no more excuses anymore to not be trained because there's so much out there that's being offered. And at Shared Hope, I love that we have so many free trainings and resources for people. And this podcast is just another one of those great avenues to travel down to understand this better and end demand. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us for the kickoff of season 4, Invading the Darkness podcast. And we can't wait to see you soon.
Thank you for listening to Shared Hope International's Invading the Darkness podcast. You can continue to listen and watch our podcast on all streaming platforms. To learn more about what Shared Hope International is doing and take action to end child sex trafficking, please visit us at sharedhope.org.